The morning sun beat down on the dusty auction yard as hundreds of horses stood in metal pens, waiting for their fate to be decided. Some were young and spirited, prancing around their small spaces with hope in their eyes. Others were older, seasoned animals who had been through this process before. But in the far corner of the yard, away from all the others, stood a horse that made everyone stop and stare. Thunder was his name, though most people just called him that dangerous horse. At nearly 19 hands high, he was a giant among horses. His massive frame cast a shadow that seemed to swallow up anyone who dared to get close. His coat was the color of midnight, so dark it seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. But it wasn't his size that kept people away. It was the look in his eyes. Those eyes burned with something that made even experienced horse handlers take a step back. There was anger there, yes, but something deeper too. Something that spoke of too many broken promises and too many hands that had hurt rather than helped. The auction had started early, and horse after horse had found new homes. Families bid on gentle ponies for their children. Ranchers selected strong working horses. Trainers picked out promising young animals they could shape and mold. But when it came to Thunder's turn, the entire yard seemed to grow quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice cracked slightly as he gestured toward the massive horse. "We have here a Clydesdale gelding, 6 years old, 17.3 hands." He paused, consulting his notes. "This horse has been through our facility before, and I'll be honest with you folks, he requires an experienced handler." That was putting it mildly. Everyone in the yard had heard the stories about Thunder, how he had put his first owner in the hospital after crushing him against a barn wall, how his second owner had returned him after just 3 weeks, claiming the horse was possessed by the devil himself. The third owner hadn't even made it a month before Thunder destroyed a brand new horse trailer and injured 2 other horses in the process. Thunder stood perfectly still in his pen, but there was nothing calm about his stillness. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm. His ears were pinned back against his massive head, and his nostrils flared with each breath. Every muscle in his body seemed coiled and ready to explode into action. A few brave souls had approached his pen earlier in the day, but Thunder had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with them. When a well-meaning trainer had tried to extend his hand in greeting, Thunder had lunged forward with teeth bared, striking the metal bars with enough force to make them ring like church bells. The trainer had stumbled backward, his face pale, and hadn't returned. "Do I hear $50? The auctioneer called out, his voice echoing across the suddenly silent crowd. $50 was practically nothing for a horse, especially one of Thunder's size and breeding. Clydesdales were valuable animals, originally, bred to pull heavy loads and work the toughest jobs. Their gentle nature and intelligence made them prized by farmers and horse lovers alike. But Thunder was different. Whatever had happened to him in his short life had twisted that gentle nature into something fierce and untouchable. The silence stretched on. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the auctioneer. A few whispered conversations started up, but no hands were raised. "Come on now, folks." The auctioneer tried again, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "This is a fine animal from good bloodlines. Surely someone can see the potential here." But potential was hard to see when all anyone could focus on was the danger. Thunder had earned his reputation honestly. The stories weren't exaggerated tales, meant to scare people. They were cold, hard facts documented in veterinary reports and insurance claims. His first owner, a man who had spent 30 years training horses, had bought Thunder as a 2-year-old. The plan was simple: train him to pull carriages for weddings and special events. Thunder's size and striking appearance would have made him perfect for the job. But from the very first day, it was clear that something was wrong. Thunder wouldn't let anyone near him. He would stand in the corner of his stall, watching every movement with those burning eyes. When someone tried to approach, he would explode into violence without warning. He wasn't just being difficult, he was fighting for his life, as if every human who came near represented some terrible threat. The trainer tried everything he knew: gentle approaches, firm handling, treats, patience, different techniques he had learned over decades of working with difficult horses. Nothing worked. If anything, Thunder seemed to get worse with time. The final incident happened on a Tuesday morning when the trainer made the mistake of turning his back on the horse while cleaning the stall. Thunder struck without warning, pinning the man against the wall with enough force to crack 3 ribs and puncture a lung. The second owner had been warned about Thunder's history, but he was young and confident. He believed that all horses could be fixed with the right approach, and he was determined to be the one to crack Thunder's code. He lasted 3 weeks before admitting defeat. Thunder had destroyed 2 sets of cross ties, kicked holes in a concrete wall, and terrorized every other animal on the property. The breaking point came when Thunder somehow escaped from his stall in the middle of the night and was found the next morning standing in the middle of the owner's living room, having crashed through a sliding glass door. The third owner had bought Thunder sight unseen, thinking he could get a bargain on a horse that just needed a firm hand. He was a rodeo cowboy who had broken his share of difficult horses, and he figured Thunder couldn't be any different from the broncs he rode professionally. He was wrong. Thunder put him in the hospital on the second day, and the cowboy sold him back to the auction house before his stitches were even removed. Now Thunder was back where he had started, unwanted and seemingly unwantable. The auction yard staff had placed him in the strongest pen they had, reinforced with extra metal bars and posted with warning signs. Even the most experienced handlers gave him a wide berth when they had to feed him or clean his area. $40? The auctioneer tried, his voice growing hoarse. 30? Still nothing. People were starting to look away, focusing on their phones or having conversations about other horses. Thunder had become an embarrassment, a reminder of what happened when horses went too far down the wrong path. In his pen, Thunder shifted his weight slightly, and the entire crowd seemed to tense up. Even that small movement was enough to remind everyone of the raw power contained in that massive frame. His hooves were the size of dinner plates, and his legs were as thick as tree trunks. If he decided to charge the fence, nothing would stop him. The auctioneer was running out of options. The day was getting late, and there were still several horses left to auction. Thunder was taking up valuable time, and it was becoming clear that no one was going to bid on him. The unspoken truth was starting to settle over the crowd like a heavy blanket. Thunder was probably going to end up at the slaughterhouse. It wasn't something anyone wanted to think about, but it was the reality of the situation. Horses that couldn't be ridden, driven, or handled safely had limited options. Some might find homes at sanctuaries or rescue facilities, but those places were already overcrowded with animals that had nowhere else to go. Thunder's reputation preceded him, and even the most dedicated horse rescues had to draw the line somewhere. $25, the auctioneer said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Surely someone can find use for this animal. A few people in the crowd exchanged glances, but still no hands went up. Thunder continued to stand motionless in his pen, but there was something different about him now. Maybe it was the way his ears had stopped moving, or the way his breathing had changed, but he seemed to sense what was happening. Even a horse, as damaged as Thunder, could understand rejection when it was this complete and final. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable for everyone involved. The auctioneer looked around the crowd one more time, his eyes pleading with someone, anyone, to make a bid. But the faces that looked back at him were filled with sympathy mixed with fear. Everyone understood that Thunder was a magnificent animal who deserved better, but no one was willing to risk their safety or their property to give him that chance. Just as the auctioneer was about to move on to the next horse, accepting that Thunder would be going back to the holding pens to await an uncertain fate, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the crowd spoke up, quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear. $25. Every head in the auction yard turned to see who had spoken. There, standing at the edge of the crowd with his weathered hands tucked into his jacket pockets, was an older man with silver hair and kind eyes. He looked like he belonged on a ranch somewhere, with his faded jeans and worn boots and the kind of deep tan that came from spending most of his life outdoors. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had heard. "Sir, did you say $25? "That's right," the man replied, his voice steady and calm. $25? A murmur went through the crowd. People turned to look at the stranger, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A few tried to catch his attention, wanting to warn him about what he was getting himself into. The man who had just bought Thunder for $25 stood quietly at the edge of the auction yard, watching as people slowly made their way toward the office to complete their purchases. His name was Ben Rodriguez, though most folks in his small Montana town just called him the Quiet Rancher or simply Ben. At 62 years old, he had spent more than half his life working cattle on the same piece of land his grandfather had homesteaded back in 1923. Ben wasn't the kind of man who drew attention to himself. He kept to his own business, paid his bills on time, and helped his neighbors when they needed it without expecting anything in return. Most people in town respected him, but few could claim to really know him. He had always been private, but in the last 2 years, since his wife Helen had passed away from cancer, he had become even more withdrawn. Helen had been his partner in every sense of the word. They had worked the ranch together, raised 2 children, together, and planned to spend their golden years traveling to all the places they had talked about visiting but never quite found the time to see. When the cancer took her, it took those dreams with it, leaving Ben alone with a ranch that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. The children had grown up and moved away years ago. His daughter lived in Seattle with her family, busy with her job, at a tech company and her kids' soccer games and piano lessons. His son was stationed overseas with the Army, calling when he could but living in a time zone that made regular conversation difficult. They both worried about their father and invited him to visit, but Ben couldn't bring himself to leave the ranch. It was where Helen's memory lived strongest, in the kitchen where she had cooked his favorite meals, in the garden where she had grown prize-winning tomatoes, in the bedroom where they had shared 43 years of marriage. But lately, the memories were becoming as painful as they were comforting. The silence in the house stretched longer each day. Ben found himself talking to Helen's picture just to hear a human voice, even if it was only his own. He had started making trips to town more often than he needed to, just to exchange a few words with the clerk at the feed store or the waitress at the diner. The loneliness was eating at him in ways he hadn't expected. That's what had brought him to the horse auction in the first place. He didn't really need another horse. His small herd of cattle could be managed perfectly well with the 2 reliable quarter horses he already owned. But Helen had loved horses, and the auction was something they used to do together. It was a way of feeling connected to her memory, even if it also reminded him of how much he missed having her beside him. He had been planning to look at a few of the gentler horses, maybe find a calm, older mare that could keep him company on the long rides around his property. But when he saw Thunder standing alone in that corner pen, something had shifted inside his chest. It wasn't pity exactly, though he certainly felt sorry for the magnificent animal. It was more like recognition. Ben understood what it felt like to be unwanted. Not in the same way as Thunder, perhaps, but lonely in a way that made the world feel hostile and cold. Since Helen's death, he had felt like he was living behind glass, watching other people go about their lives while he remained separate and untouchable. Friends and neighbors meant well, but they didn't know what to say to him anymore. They invited him to dinner parties where he sat quietly in the corner, or to church socials where he nodded politely and left early. Everyone treated him with kindness, but also with a kind of careful distance, as if his grief might be contagious. When the auctioneer had started calling for bids on Thunder, and the silence had stretched out like a physical thing, Ben had felt his heart break a little. He knew what it was like to stand in a room full of people and feel completely alone. He knew what it was like to have everyone decide you were too difficult, too damaged, too much trouble to deal with. So when he raised his voice and made that $25 bid, he wasn't entirely sure what he was thinking. He certainly wasn't planning to train Thunder or turn him into a riding horse. He had no illusions about being able to fix whatever was wrong with the animal. But he could give Thunder a place to be, even if that place was just a pasture where he could be alone and unwanted in peace. The paperwork took longer than expected. The auction house staff seemed nervous about selling Thunder to anyone, and they made Ben sign several extra waivers acknowledging that they weren't responsible for what might happen. They asked him multiple times if he was sure he knew what he was getting into and whether he had experience with difficult horses. Ben answered their questions patiently and honestly. Yes, he had worked with horses his whole life. No, he had never dealt with one quite like Thunder. Yes, he understood the risks. No, he wasn't planning to try to ride him or work him with cattle. He just wanted to give the horse a place to live. Finally, the paperwork was complete, and it was time to load Thunder into the trailer. This was the part everyone had been dreading. Several of the auction house staff had gathered to help, though they all maintained a respectful distance from Thunder's pen. The plan was to use a long rope and a series of panels to guide Thunder into the trailer, without anyone having to get too close. But Ben had a different idea. He walked straight up to Thunder's pen and stood there quietly, his hands resting on the top rail. Thunder pinned his ears and took a few steps back, but he didn't charge the fence like he had with everyone else. "Easy, big fellow," Ben said softly, his voice carrying the same tone he had used with nervous cattle and skittish horses for decades. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to take a ride." Thunder's ears flicked forward for just a moment, before pinning back again. But there was something different about his posture now. He was still tense and ready to fight, but he was also listening. Ben opened the gate to Thunder's pen slowly and stepped inside. The auction staff immediately began protesting, telling him he was making a serious mistake, that Thunder was dangerous and unpredictable. But Ben ignored them. He moved slowly and deliberately, never making eye contact with Thunder directly, never trying to corner him or force him to do anything. Thunder watched every movement with those intelligent, wary eyes. When Ben reached the middle of the pen, the massive horse took a few steps closer, close enough that Ben could see the scars on his neck and shoulders from previous encounters with restraints and ropes. Close enough to see the way Thunder's nostrils flared as he tried to read this strange new human who wasn't behaving like all the others. "You've had a rough time of it, haven't you?" Ben said quietly, still not looking directly at Thunder. "I know how that feels. Sometimes it seems like the whole world is against you, and there's nobody who understands." Thunder's ears came forward again, and this time they stayed forward. He was still ready to run or fight, but he was also genuinely curious about this human who spoke to him like he was a partner rather than a problem. Ben extended his hand slowly, palm up, not trying to touch Thunder, but simply offering. Thunder stretched his massive neck forward, his nostrils fluttering as he investigated Ben's scent. For a moment, the two of them stood frozen in that position, horse and human sizing each other up across a chasm of mutual wariness. Then, so gently that Ben almost didn't feel it, Thunder's muzzle brushed against his palm. It was the lightest possible contact, over almost before it began, but it was contact nonetheless. The auction staff, watching from outside the pen, fell completely silent. "There's a good boy," Ben murmured, still not moving his hand. "You're not so savage after all, are you? You're just scared and tired and sick of being hurt." Thunder pulled his head back, but his ears remained forward, and there was something different in his eyes now. The burning anger was still there, but it was mixed with something that might have been hope or at least curiosity. Ben spent the next 20 minutes just standing in that pen, talking quietly to Thunder about nothing in particular. He told him about the ranch, about the rolling hills and the creek that ran through the property. He mentioned the other horses, older now and gentle, who might be willing to be neighbors if Thunder was interested in company. He talked about Helen, too, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because Thunder looked like he understood something about loss. When it came time to load Thunder into the trailer, Ben simply walked toward the open door and waited. Thunder followed, not immediately, but after a few minutes of consideration. He approached the trailer like he approached everything else, with caution and readiness to bolt at the first sign of trouble. But when Ben stepped into the trailer and turned around to wait, Thunder took a deep breath and followed him in. The ride back to the ranch was quiet except for the sound of the truck engine and Thunder's occasional movements in the trailer. Ben found himself talking to the horse through the small window that connected the cab to the trailer, telling him about what he could expect when they arrived. It felt good to have someone to talk to, even if that someone was a horse who might or might not be listening. The ranch sat in a valley between two gentle hills, with a small creek running along the eastern boundary and old-growth trees scattered throughout the pastures. The house was modest but well-maintained, painted white with green shutters that Helen had insisted on because the first week with Thunder was like a careful dance where both partners were still learning the steps. Ben had dealt with difficult horses before, but never one quite like Thunder. Most horses, even the stubborn or fearful ones, wanted some kind of connection with humans. They might be afraid or defensive, but deep down they were looking for a leader, a friend, someone to trust. Thunder was different. He seemed to have given up on the idea that humans could be anything other than a source of pain and disappointment. Every morning, Ben would walk out to the pasture with Thunder's hay and fresh water, moving slowly and deliberately. Thunder would watch him from whatever corner of the pasture felt safest, his massive head raised high and his ears constantly moving, tracking every sound and movement. He never approached while Ben was there, but he didn't run away either. It was progress of a sort, even if it was measured in the tiniest increments. Ben had learned patience over the years, working with cattle and horses and the land itself. You couldn't rush a cow that didn't want to move, couldn't force hay to grow faster than the weather allowed, couldn't make a horse trust you just because you wanted it to happen. So he settled into a routine with Thunder that had no timeline, no expectations beyond the simple act of showing up every day. He would arrive at the pasture at the same time each morning, just after sunrise when the Montana air was still crisp, and the grass was heavy with dew. Thunder would be waiting, though never close to the gate. Always in that same far corner, as if he had spent the night calculating the exact distance that would keep him safe while still allowing him to observe what was happening. Ben would fill the water tank first, the sound of the hose and the splash of fresh water becoming part of the morning ritual. Thunder's ears would prick forward at the sound, and sometimes Ben could see him lick his lips, but he never moved from his corner until Ben was gone. Then Ben would spread the hay in the feeder, enough for a horse Thunder's size, but never so much that it would spoil if Thunder was too nervous to eat right away. The whole process took about 15 minutes, and Ben made sure to move at the same pace every day. No sudden movements, no attempts to get closer to Thunder, no frustrated gestures when the big horse remained stubbornly distant. Just the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that trust, when it came at all, came slowly. After feeding, Ben would walk to the fence that separated Thunder's pasture from the home paddock, where Dusty and Sage spent their days. The two older mares had shown immediate interest in their new neighbor, often standing as close to the fence line as they could get, trying to make contact with Thunder through the rails. Thunder, for his part, seemed curious about them too, though he would never get close enough for actual interaction. Ben would lean against the fence and drink his morning coffee from the thermos Helen had bought him for Christmas 5 years ago. It was one of those small rituals that connected him to his old life, when Helen would have been there beside him, probably making plans for the day or commenting on how the weather was affecting her garden. "Look at that," he would say to Thunder, though the horse was always too far away to hear clearly. "Dusty's trying to get your attention again. She's a friendly old girl, been with me for 18 years now. Lost her right to arthritis a few years back, but she's still got plenty of spirit." Thunder's ears would flick toward Ben's voice, and sometimes the big horse would take a step or two in their direction before catching himself and retreating to his safe corner again. But Ben could see the curiosity there, the way Thunder's intelligent eyes tracked every movement, every gesture. The breakthrough, when it came, was so small that most people would have missed it entirely. It was on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 days after Thunder had arrived at the ranch. Ben was going through his usual routine, filling the water tank and spreading hay, when he noticed that Thunder wasn't in his usual corner. Instead, he was standing about halfway across the pasture, still a good distance away, but notably closer than he had ever been before. Ben finished his chores without acknowledging the change, but his heart was beating a little faster. When he walked to his usual spot at the fence to drink his coffee, Thunder remained where he was instead of retreating further. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Thunder was close enough that Ben didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. "Morning, Thunder," Ben said quietly, settling into his familiar position against the fence post. "Nice day today. Supposed to warm up this afternoon. Helen always said the best days were the ones that started cool and ended warm. Said it gave you time to appreciate both kinds of weather." Thunder's ears came forward and he took another small step in Ben's direction. Not close enough to touch, not even close enough for Ben to see the details of his expression clearly, but closer. Definitely closer. Ben sipped his coffee and continued talking, his voice carrying easily across the morning stillness. He told Thunder about the ranch, about how his grandfather had bought the land from a railroad company that was selling off parcels to settlers. He talked about learning to ride on these same hills, about meeting Helen at a church social when they were both 22 and too shy to dance together until the third song. Thunder listened with the intensity of an animal that had learned to pay attention to every nuance of human behavior. But there was something different about his attention now, less defensive, more genuinely curious. When Ben finished his coffee and prepared to leave, Thunder watched him go without moving back toward his corner. The pattern continued for the next few days, with Thunder positioning himself a little closer each morning. By the end of the second week, he was close enough that Ben could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle and the way his coat caught the early morning light. Still not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel like they were sharing the same space, rather than simply occupying opposite ends of a pasture. It was during the third week that Thunder made his first real move toward contact. Ben had finished the morning routine and was settling in with his coffee when he noticed Thunder walking slowly in his direction. Not the quick, nervous movements he usually made, but a deliberate, considered approach that suggested he had been thinking about this for some time. Ben forced himself to remain perfectly still, not even turning his head to watch Thunder's progress. He could hear the massive hooves on the grass, the soft snuffling sounds Thunder made as he investigated unfamiliar scents, the creak of leather as the big horse shifted his weight. Thunder got within about 10 feet before stopping. Close enough that Ben could hear his breathing, close enough that he had to resist the urge to turn around and acknowledge what was happening. They stayed that way for perhaps 5 minutes. Ben, facing the fence and sipping his coffee while Thunder stood behind him, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence. Then Thunder took 2 more steps forward, bringing him close enough that Ben could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body. Still, Ben didn't turn around. He had learned that direct eye contact often felt threatening to horses, especially ones that had been hurt or frightened. Instead, he continued talking in the same quiet tone he had been using for weeks. "I've been thinking about getting the fence between your pasture and the mare's paddock fixed," he said, as if Thunder getting this close was the most natural thing in the world. "There's a section where the wire's getting loose. Dusty and Sage keep trying to push through it to get to you. I think they're getting lonely for some new company." Thunder's breathing changed slightly, becoming deeper and more relaxed. Ben could sense him settling, the way his posture shifted from ready to flee to genuinely at rest. It was the first time since Thunder had arrived that Ben had felt the big horse truly relax in his presence. When Ben finally finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he turned around slowly, giving Thunder plenty of time to back away if he wanted to. Thunder watched him with those intelligent dark eyes, but he didn't retreat. Up close, Ben could see the scars more clearly, the places where halters had rubbed and ropes had burned, but he could also see the nobility in Thunder's bearing, the strength and intelligence that had been buried under layers of fear and mistrust. "You're a good boy," Ben said quietly, still not making any move to reach toward Thunder. "You're going to be just fine here. Take all the time you need." Thunder stood perfectly still as Ben walked away, and when Ben looked back from the gate, the big horse was still watching him, ears forward and head high, but without the desperate alertness that had characterized his first weeks on the ranch. That afternoon, while Ben was working on repairing some fence in another pasture, he heard a sound that made him stop and listen carefully. It was a horse calling out, but not in distress or anger. It was the kind of call horses made when they were trying to get attention or communicate with other horses. When he looked toward Thunder's pasture, he saw the big horse standing at the fence line that separated him from Dusty and Sage, his head stretched over the top rail as he tried to make contact with the 2 mares. Dusty and Sage were pressed against, the fence from their side clearly delighted by this development. All 3 horses were making soft wickering sounds, the kind of gentle communication that horses used. Understanding Thunder's story didn't happen all at once. It came in pieces, like putting together a puzzle where most of the pieces had been scattered by wind and time. Ben was a patient man by nature, but discovering the truth about Thunder's past became something more than patience. It became a kind of detective work that helped him understand not just what had happened to the horse, but why he behaved the way he did. The first real clue came from Dr. Patricia Wells, the veterinarian, who had been called to examine Thunder during his stay with his second owner. Ben had contacted her after Thunder had been on the ranch for about 6 weeks, not because the horse was sick, but because he wanted to understand what kind of medical history he was dealing with. Dr. Wells was a woman in her 50s who had spent most of her career working with large animals in rural Montana. She had seen plenty of difficult horses, but Thunder had stuck in her memory for reasons that went beyond his size or his reputation. "I remember him clearly," she told Ben over the phone, her voice thoughtful and a little sad. "Beautiful animal, perfect conformation, but there was something broken in him that went deeper than anything physical. When I examined him, he was so tense I could feel his muscles trembling under my hands, not from pain, but from pure terror." She had tried to sedate Thunder for the examination, but even the mild tranquilizer hadn't calmed him enough for a thorough check. What she had been able to see, though, had told a story that made her angry and heartbroken at the same time. There were marks on him, Dr. Wells explained. Old rope burns on his neck and legs, places where he had fought restraint so hard that he had injured himself. His teeth showed signs of having worn against metal bits that were too harsh for his mouth. But the worst part was his eyes. I've seen fear in horses before, but this was different. This was an animal who had given up hope that humans would ever treat him with kindness. Dr. Wells had recommended to Thunder's second owner that the horse needed time and gentle handling, not training or correction. But the owner had been impatient, convinced that Thunder was just being stubborn and needed firmer handling. The relationship had deteriorated quickly from there. Ben also reached out to Thunder's first owner, a man named Robert Chen who ran a carriage business outside of Billings. Robert was reluctant to talk about Thunder at first, clearly feeling guilty about how things had ended between them. But when Ben explained that he wasn't looking to blame anyone, just to understand Thunder better, Robert opened up about what had happened. "I bought Thunder when he was just 2 years old," Robert explained during their phone conversation. "He came from a breeding farm that had a good reputation, and his bloodlines were excellent. The plan was to train him to pull carriages for weddings and special events. With his size and looks, he would have been perfect for the job. But from the very beginning, Thunder had been different from other horses Robert had worked with. Most young horses are eager to please once they understand what you want from them," Robert said. "They might be nervous or confused, but they want to connect with their handler. Thunder acted like he expected to be hurt every time someone approached him. Robert had tried everything he could think of. He brought in different trainers, tried various approaches, even consulted with animal behaviorists. Nothing worked. If anything, Thunder seemed to get worse with each attempt to work with him. The thing that bothered me most," Robert continued, "was that I could see the intelligence in his eyes. This wasn't a stupid or mean horse. He was smart enough to understand what we wanted from him, but something was preventing him from trusting us enough to cooperate." The final incident that led to Robert selling Thunder had happened during what should have been a routine training session. Robert had been working with Thunder in a round pen, trying to get the young horse comfortable with basic commands. Thunder had seemed calmer than usual, almost as if he might be ready to make some progress. "I turned my back for just a second to pick up a lead rope," Robert remembered, "and Thunder just exploded. It wasn't like he was attacking me. It was more like he was having a panic attack. He crashed into the fence panels so hard that he knocked 2 of them down, and then he turned and came at me. I don't think he was trying to hurt me specifically, but he was so terrified and confused that he didn't know what else to do." Robert had ended up in the hospital with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. But what haunted him most wasn't the physical injury. It was the look in Thunder's eyes immediately after the incident, not anger or satisfaction, but something that looked almost like relief, as if Thunder had finally done what he expected to do all along. After talking to Robert and Dr. Wells, Ben began to suspect that Thunder's problems had started much earlier than anyone realized. He decided to contact the breeding farm where Thunder had been born, hoping to learn more about his early life. The farm was owned by a family called the Andersons, who had been breeding draft horses for 3 generations. When Ben called and explained his interest in Thunder's history, Mrs. Anderson was immediately sympathetic. "Oh, that poor baby," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "We still feel terrible about what happened to him. We tried to warn the people who bought him, but they didn't want to listen." The story that emerged was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Thunder had been born during a particularly difficult spring when the farm was dealing with multiple crises at once. An early snowstorm had damaged several buildings, and Mrs. Anderson's husband had been hospitalized with a heart attack. The farm was understaffed and overwhelmed, and Thunder's mother, a mare named Starlight, had been one of several animals that didn't receive the attention they needed. Starlight was always a nervous mare, Mrs. Anderson explained. And with all the chaos on the farm, she became even more anxious. When Thunder was born, she was so stressed that she rejected him almost immediately. We tried everything we could to help her bond with her foal, but she just couldn't seem to accept him. Thunder had been bottle-fed by humans from just a few days old, which should have created a strong bond between him and his caretakers. But the farm workers were too busy with emergency repairs and other animals to spend the kind of time with Thunder that a rejected foal needed. He had received adequate physical care, enough food, shelter, and basic handling to keep him alive, but not the emotional nurturing that young horses require to develop trust in humans. "We should have found him a foster mare," Mrs. Anderson said, the regret clear in her voice. "There were other farms that might have had a mare who could have adopted him, but we thought we could manage it ourselves, and we were wrong." As Thunder grew, his lack of early bonding became more and more obvious. Where other young horses were curious and playful, Thunder was suspicious and defensive. He learned to associate human contact with being restrained for medical procedures or forced to go places he didn't want to go. By the time he was weaned, he had already developed the fundamental mistrust that would follow him through every subsequent home. "The people who bought him seemed nice enough," Mrs. Anderson continued, "but they were focused on his potential as a carriage horse. They didn't understand that he needed therapy, not training. We tried to explain that he was going to need special handling, but they were confident they could work with him." The pattern had repeated itself with each subsequent owner. Well-meaning people who saw Thunder's size and breeding and believed they could overcome his behavioral issues through traditional training methods. None of them had understood that Thunder's problems weren't about stubbornness or lack of training. They were about deep-seated trauma that had started when he was just days old. Ben found himself thinking about Thunder's story long into the evening after his conversations with Mrs. Anderson. He understood now why the horse had responded differently to him than to previous owners. Ben wasn't trying to train Thunder or get him to do anything specific. He was simply offering the horse a chance to exist without pressure, to learn that not all humans wanted something from him. The knowledge of Thunder's history changed how Ben approached his daily interactions with the horse. He understood now that Thunder's defensive behaviors weren't personal. They were survival mechanisms that had been reinforced by years of disappointing interactions with humans. Every time Thunder had started to trust someone, that person had eventually asked him to do something that triggered his panic response. Ben made a conscious decision not to ask Thunder for anything beyond accepting his presence. No halters, no lead ropes, no attempts to touch or handle him unless Thunder initiated the contact. If Thunder ever became calm and trusting enough to accept more interaction, it would have to be entirely on the horse's terms. The change in Thunder over the following weeks was subtle but unmistakable. He began spending more time near the fence line where Ben did his morning routine, close enough that they could have quiet conversations without Ben having to raise his voice. Thunder's posture became less defensive, his movements more fluid and natural. Most importantly, Thunder began showing interest in things beyond simple survival. He would watch Ben working around the ranch with curious attention rather than fearful wariness. He started interacting more with Dusty and Sage through the fence, even playing gentle games where, the first time Thunder let Ben touch him, it wasn't planned or dramatic. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, almost 8 months after Thunder had arrived at the ranch. Ben was going through his usual routine of filling the water tank when he noticed that the valve was stuck. He was struggling with the stubborn mechanism, muttering under his breath about needing to replace the whole system, when he felt a gentle nudge against his shoulder. He turned around to find Thunder standing right beside him, close enough that Ben could feel the warmth of his breath. The massive horse had approached so quietly that Ben hadn't heard him coming, and now Thunder was investigating the situation with obvious curiosity, his soft muzzle just inches from Ben's hands as he worked on the valve. "Well, hello there," Ben said quietly, not wanting to startle Thunder by making sudden movements. "Decided to come see what all the fuss is about?" Thunder's ears were forward, and his expression was relaxed and interested rather than defensive. When Ben went back to working on the stubborn valve, Thunder stayed right where he was, occasionally stretching his neck to get a better look at what Ben was doing. Without thinking about it, Ben reached up and scratched Thunder gently behind the ears, the same absent-minded gesture he had used with horses thousands of times before. Thunder went perfectly still for a moment, and Ben realized what he had done. But instead of pulling away or moving back to a safe distance, Thunder leaned into the touch, closing his eyes and making a soft, rumbling sound of contentment. They stayed that way for several minutes, Ben working on the water valve with one hand while scratching Thunder's neck and ears with the other. It was such a natural, easy interaction that it felt like they had been doing this for years, rather than sharing their first moment of real physical contact. "You know what?" Ben said as he finally got the valve working properly. "I think you've been ready for this for a while now. I just didn't want to push you." Thunder opened his eyes and looked at Ben with an expression that was unmistakably affectionate. Not grateful exactly, though there was certainly gratitude there. It was more like the look that passed between old friends who understood each other perfectly. From that day forward, Thunder's transformation accelerated dramatically. Within a week, he was greeting Ben at the gate every morning, clearly eager for their daily interaction. He would follow Ben around the pasture as Ben checked fences and filled feeders, staying close enough to touch but never getting in the way. The real breakthrough came when Ben decided to open the gate between Thunder's pasture and the paddock where Dusty and Sage lived. He had been thinking about it for weeks, watching the three horses interact through the fence and seeing how much they all seemed to want closer contact. But Thunder's history made Ben cautious about changing anything too quickly. When he finally opened the gate on a warm spring morning, Thunder approached it slowly as if he couldn't quite believe it was really open. Dusty and Sage were waiting on their side, clearly excited about the possibility of finally meeting their neighbor properly. Thunder stepped through the gate like he was entering a new world. For the first time in his life, he had the freedom to choose his companions rather than being isolated from them. The three horses spent the better part of the morning getting acquainted, sniffing each other, playing gentle games, and establishing the kind of social hierarchy that horses create naturally when they're allowed to interact freely. Dusty, despite being the oldest, clearly became the leader of the little herd. She was confident and calm, exactly the kind of steady influence that Thunder needed. Sage was younger and more playful, and she seemed to bring out a side of Thunder that no one had ever seen before. By afternoon, Ben watched in amazement as Thunder actually ran and played, his massive hooves thundering across the pasture as he chased Sage in wide circles around the paddock. It was the first time Ben had ever seen Thunder behave like a normal, happy horse. The transformation was so complete that if someone had told Ben this was the same animal who had been considered dangerous and unmanageable just months before, he wouldn't have believed it. The changes in Thunder were mirrored by changes in Ben himself. The daily routine of caring for Thunder, the small victories and gradual progress, had given him a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt since Helen's death. More than that, Thunder's journey from isolation to connection had shown Ben something important about his own healing process. Ben had been isolating himself just as completely as Thunder had, building walls around his grief and refusing to let anyone get close enough to help. Watching Thunder learn to trust again, to accept companionship and care, had made Ben realize that he was doing the same thing to himself that Thunder's previous owners had done to the horse, trying to force healing instead of allowing it to happen naturally. Ben started making small changes in his own life. He began accepting invitations from neighbors again, not forcing himself to be social, but allowing himself to enjoy company when it felt natural. He started calling his children more often, not to worry them with his loneliness, but to share the stories of Thunder's progress and to reconnect with the parts of his life that brought him joy. The biggest change came when Mrs. Patterson, who owned the neighboring ranch, started stopping by more frequently to check on Thunder's progress. Martha Patterson was a widow herself, about Ben's age, who had been running her late husband's cattle operation for the past 5 years. She had always been a friend and neighbor, but Ben had kept their interactions strictly business since Helen's death. Martha was fascinated by Thunder's transformation and would often time her visits to coincide with Ben's morning routine. She had a natural way with horses and seemed to understand instinctively how to interact with Thunder without overwhelming him. More importantly, she understood what Ben had accomplished with Thunder and appreciated the patience and kindness it had required. "You know," Martha said one morning as they watched Thunder grazing peacefully with Dusty and Sage, "I never would have believed a horse could change this much if I hadn't seen it myself." Ben smiled, scratching Thunder's forehead, as the big horse stood calmly beside them. "I don't think he changed as much as people might think. I think he was always this horse inside. He just needed someone to give him the space to figure out how to be himself again." Martha looked at Ben thoughtfully. "Seems to me that applies to more than just horses." Ben understood what she meant, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't feel the need to change the subject or retreat into his protective shell. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think you're right about that." Thunder became something of a local celebrity as word of his transformation spread through the community. People who had heard about the savage giant horse that no one could handle would stop by to see for themselves how completely he had changed. Dr. Wells made a special trip to examine him and was amazed by what she found. "This is the same horse?" she asked Ben as Thunder stood calmly for his examination, even lifting his feet politely when she asked to check his hooves. "His whole demeanor is completely different. He's like a different animal." But Ben knew Thunder wasn't a different animal at all. He was the same intelligent, sensitive horse he had always been, finally free to express his true nature without fear or defensiveness. The gentleness had always been there, buried under layers of trauma and mistrust. All Ben had done was create the conditions that allowed Thunder's natural personality to emerge. The real test came when Robert Chen, Thunder's first owner, heard about the transformation and asked to visit. Ben was nervous about the meeting, unsure how Thunder would react to seeing someone from his difficult past. But when Robert arrived at the ranch, Thunder approached him with curiosity rather than fear. Robert was visibly emotional as he watched Thunder greet him calmly. "I can't believe this is the same horse," he said, his voice thick with regret. "If I had known then what you've shown me now." "You did the best you could with what you knew at the time," Ben told him gently. Thunder's not holding grudges. He's focused on what's happening now, not what happened before. It was true. Thunder seemed to have let go of his past completely, living entirely in the present moment with the confidence of a horse who knew he was safe and valued. He had learned to trust not just Ben, but the whole concept of human kindness. When strangers visited the ranch, Thunder would approach them with friendly curiosity rather than defensive aggression. On quiet evenings, Ben would often find himself sitting in Thunder's pasture, reading, or just enjoying the peaceful atmosphere while Thunder grazed nearby. Sometimes Martha would join them, bringing a book of her own or simply enjoying the companionship. Thunder would move freely between them, occasionally resting his massive head on someone's shoulder or investigating whatever they were reading with gentle curiosity. During these evening sessions, Ben would sometimes talk to Thunder about Helen, sharing memories and feelings that he had kept locked away for too long. Thunder would listen with the focused attention of someone who understood loss, his ears forward and his expression calm and accepting. "She would have loved you," Ben told Thunder one evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "She always said that the best relationships